Damaged Defenders by Sherza. Chapter 6. Gambit, Nightcrawler, and Storm. Remy had always been skeptical of so-called heroes, especially ones like Captain America. People, in his experience, just weren't that noble and good-hearted, and there couldn't be possibly any way that Captain America especially could live up to the legends. After all, how good could a guy that depended primarily on a shield be? Turned out that Cap was at least not a complete moron. He certainly had a good grasp of strategy. For the most part, he kept the X-Men together, acknowledging that they knew each other fairly well after a minimum of 6 months, in Logan's case, and as much as a decade, Scott, Hank, and Jean, of working together. He had the folks capable of flight, spreading out and charged with keeping the enemy as contained as humanly possible. He put Stormy on hitting the portal itself alongside Thor, since they were able to control lightning. And wasn't that a trip and a half? Everyone else was scattered around on the ground in pairs. They needed as many long-range fighters on the ground as possible, so Remy volunteered to work with the captain. He was one of the few on the team who didn't go all goo-goo-eyed at working with the man. Scott was still looking stunned 10 minutes after finding it, and with his eyes hidden from sight. That was no mean feat. Several of the others weren't too much better. Plus, Remy hadn't been with the X-Men long. Only about a year, and his life had ensured that he remained adaptable, so he'd suffer less for working with someone he didn't know. As fast as the X-Jet was, by the time they got there, the portal was open and enemy flyers were pouring out of it at a truly alarming rate. Remy laughed when Logan didn't even wait for the jet to land before he jumped out the back, earning him an irritating yell from Scott. Thankfully, Scott had known better than to recommend depending on Logan's teamwork abilities. Angel, Ro, and Kurt ditched moments later, but at least that had been planned. The rest of them hustled out when the jet landed. Unfortunately, the jet didn't have any offensive capabilities, so it couldn't be used in the fight. Scott had been forced to land on top of a relatively flat building and pray the jet would still be there when this was over. Remy mentally cringed at the captain's wide-eyed gape when he saw Hank, fully expecting the captain to flip his shit. He was from the 40s after all, and mutants had been all but unknown then, and prejudiced attitudes about a number of things had been rife, the same as today, even if it was about different things now. But then the captain seemed to shake it off. "Sorry for the stirring," he said. "I didn't mean to be rude." Hank just smiled at him and waved off his apology, taking off at a galloping run with Iron Man flying overhead to find himself some targets to beat up on. Then the captain had turned to Remy. Remy hadn't quite been able to prevent himself from giving the man a defiant look. He either ignored it or didn't realize that was what Remy was doing. He just held out a hand and gave Remy a friendly smile. "Gambit, good to meet you," he said. Remy shook his hand, but that was really all they had time for. The flyers were zooming by overhead, shooting pretty much everything in sight. Remy wasted no further time digging into his pocket for his collapsed bow staff and some cards. He was just grateful there would be no lack of ammunition for this fight. Cards made for damn good ammo for him, but even he could only carry so many packs of cards in his pockets. Fortunately, with all the rubble getting kicked up, if he ran out of cards, he'd still be able to go after the flyers. If any of the increasing number of foot soldiers were stupid enough to try their luck, well then they deserved what they'd get. For a little bit, Remy fell into an easy pattern of charge, aim, throw. Unfortunately, not for too long. Only about 2 minutes, maybe 3. Even then, the entire time he was focused on the flyers, he could hear the captain's shield hitting things behind him. Remy's opinion of his abilities improved further thanks to the fact that he didn't once have to defend himself from an attack from behind. Unfortunately, after a minute or two, there were just too many foot soldiers on the ground for him to ignore. He gave a feral grin as he extended his bow staff. It was a Tony special, as the man had somehow managed to get his hands on the formula for adamantium, and had Remy test it against his ability to charge things. Turned out, adamantium took a charge beautifully, but it was tough enough not to explode even after innumerable charges. Tony had promptly made Remy the bow staff, which not only facilitated Remy's acrobatics and made for a hell of a weapon even when Remy wasn't charging it, but allowed him to use his charge safely, for himself anyway, at short range. Now that he was paying more direct attention to the captain, Remy was thoroughly startled because he'd assumed the guy was just standing stolidly in place, shield bashing everything in sight. He'd been partially correct, but he'd missed the magnitude of it by quite a margin and had been vastly incorrect about the rest. Because the captain was throwing his shield every which way, and unless something managed to slap it out of the air unexpectedly, it always returned to Roger's hands. It was virtually identical to Scott's ability to bounce his optic blasts off multiple surfaces to hit things. And Rogers wasn't exactly standing still. He was leaping and twisting almost as well as Remy himself could, and Remy had been accused many times of being half cat. He was so flexible and acrobatic. Maybe there was such a thing as real heroes after all, because the captain definitely seemed to be living up to his legend. Remy shook himself and turned back to the fight, leaping over a Chitauri as it rushed him, trying to skewer him with its half-spear, half-ray gun. Remy planted the butt end of his staff on the back of the thing's belt before his feet even touched the ground and charged the staff, blowing the belt to bits and the Chitauri that was wearing it in half, then whirled both staffs sweeping low to take another Chitauri out at the knees. In the same movement, he flung a handful of cards with his free hand, nailing 3 more approaching Chitauri. Kurt teleported to the edge of the nearest building when he left the jet and crouched there for a moment, observing the battle before he jumped in. He needed to get a feel for how fast the flyers moved and what their weaknesses might be that he could exploit before he started fighting. It didn't take him more than about a minute to figure out what he could do that would do the most good. It helped that the flyers were, for the most part, going in straight lines down the main thoroughfare in front of Stark Tower before they split off and started weaving all over the place. If he stuck close to the tower, he wouldn't have to contend with the flyers changing directions on him too much. Kurt teleported and landed on one of the flyers, between the driver and the shooter. He kicked the shooter in the face, then grabbed the helmet of the driver and teleported again, landing on a building roof, the struggling Chitauri driver dangling by his helmet. Kurt let him drop, and watched as the flyer he'd deprived of its driver crashed, exploding rather spectacularly. It took him a few more teleports before he had it down pat, but in the end it was particularly easy to teleport the drivers out of the flyers. It helped that the drivers were hunched over with their heads down, shoulders braced against what was either a support harness or the steering system for the flyers. Kurt wasn't sure which. At any rate, the drivers were defenseless, and the shooters in the rear of the flyer were usually concentrating on shooting things, not on the driver. Within about 2 minutes, Kurt was teleporting as rapidly as he could manage, stripping drivers out of flyers, and letting them drop off of buildings. Amusingly, the Chitauri did not seem to be in communication with each other. Either that, or they were really stupid, as they weren't changing tactics at all, not in response to him or in response to any of the others that he could see. And then, just after he'd landed on a roof and dropped his latest driver, something made a really big noise, attracting his attention. He turned to look and stared in horror. "Oh, mein Gott," he whispered. Normally, he tried not to lapse into German, mostly because none of the other X-Men were fluent in it, and it struck Kurt as rude to say things they couldn't understand. But for this, he would forgive himself for the slip-up. Because flying down the street was... Kurt wasn't actually sure what the hell to call it. It bore a passing resemblance to a whale. A whale that was something like 10 times the size of a blue whale and had teeth taller than a man, and bony armor all over it. And somehow this monstrosity flew through the air. Kurt had largely been ignoring the lightning that was flashing like a strobe light against the increasingly dark sky. He trusted Ororo to control where the lightning hit, even if he didn't know Thor to trust him to do the same. He had, though, wondered what had them hitting things basically non-stop. If this sort of creature was what they'd been hitting, it explained a lot. Kurt left the flying whale to the others. He had no hope whatever of bringing that monstrosity down. He wouldn't even know where to start. After a moment to regain his mental equilibrium, Kurt went back to depriving the smaller flyers of their drivers. Storm smiled as she called the winds to bear her aloft. She loved flying, loved the freedom of it, the exhilaration of it. She landed on one of the buildings next to Stark Tower. A few seconds later, a big blonde-haired man landed a few feet away, hammer in hand. This, then, was Thor. He certainly fit the descriptions of the legendary god. "Milady Storm," Thor said, giving her what could only be described as a courtly bow. "It is a pleasure to make your acquaintance. I am told by Anthony Stark that you are able to control lightning." "And many other aspects of weather," Storm said. Well, all of them, really, but there was no cause to brag. "But lightning will be of most use to us here." "Agreed," Shall we then? He asked, giving her a wide, happy grin before he turned his attention skyward and lifted his hammer. Storm's eyes went wide. She could feel the sky responding, feel the weather systems shifting, the rapid build of clouds and electricity in the air that heralded the coming of lightning. She watched in surprise as multiple lightning strikes hit the head of Thor's hammer, without hurting him, it must be said, before he redirected it at the open portal over their heads. Well then, whether he was a god or not, she would leave to the theologists. Whatever he was, he certainly shared her ability to control lightning. Storm gave him a pleased, almost wild grin before she too tilted her head back and her eyes filmed white. Storm swiftly discovered two things. One, she and Thor could not call lightning at the same time. When they did, the lightning went wild, unable to obey two masters at once. Secondly, she was able to aim multiple strikes in the time it took Thor to aim one, but his one was stronger than any one of hers due to the fact that he called and concentrated multiple strikes at his hammer before aiming it at the portal. Storm didn't have anything with which to concentrate multiple strikes, so she couldn't increase the damage done by a single strike. Still, it took them remarkably little time to work out a system, each of them taking turns, giving the other a chance to catch their breath between strikes. It was working remarkably well. Which was a good thing, because the lightning was keeping some truly enormous monsters at bay, striking them down or forcing them back before they could get through the portal. She and Thor had been forced into letting the smaller flyers through in order to stop as many of the monsters as possible, because they were both aware that if many of those got through, they were going to have a very, very serious problem. As it was, even trying their hardest, they weren't able to stop all of the monsters from getting through. Occasionally, one would manage to sneak out behind a fellow monster that was currently getting fried by lightning, escaping unscathed or with little damage to wreak havoc on the city. Inevitably, after the first few minutes, she and Thor began, unofficially, competing over who took down the most monsters. Thor kept grinning over her like a kid in a candy store. And while Storm managed to keep from grinning too goofily, she understood the thrill Thor was obviously feeling.